We're now going to turn our attention to the interaction of the forces we've learned so far together. This is where you get economics to really play a part inside of decision making. We've learned the laws of supply and the laws of demand. So far we've only considered the laws of supply and the laws of demand in isolation with one another. Now we turn our attention to the interaction of these forces together. The price mechanism has several aspects to it. These include rationing. Given that resources are scarce and wants are infinite, the price system rations depending on demand so that it meets supply. For example, should demand exceed supply, price increases to reduce quantity demanded until equilibrium is reached. Incentive. High prices act as an incentive to producers on other markets to leave them and come into this one because of potential profit earned. Signalling. Prices act as a signal to producers. If prices increase, then this is a signal to produce more. Equilibrium occurs when the quantity supplied equals the quantity demanded and there is no incentive to change and there is a state of rest. That's illustrated on the diagram in front of you, whereby there's excess supply and excess demand in two diagrams. The excess supply being the top, the excess demand being the bottom. The state of equilibrium occurs at point A, and that's represented by P0, Q0. Fluctuations to and from equilibrium may be thought to engender three phases or processes. Firstly, quantity demanded is greater than quantity supplied. There is excess demand or a shortage, and the effect is that prices will rise. If we cast our gaze back, that would be the situation from point F to point A, where there is excess demand, insufficient supply, and eventually, through the correction of the market mechanism, we're back at point A. Similarly, equilibrium, prices remain the same. That's where quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. Whereas quantity demanded being less than quantity supplied, and excess supply or surplus, prices will fall. That's the top right-hand diagram, where supply is point C, demand is point B for the given price increase. And eventually prices will fall, returning excess supply back to the point of P0. And insufficient demand back to a point of equilibrium as well, point A from B. Often in today's economy, governments will attempt to interfere with the market mechanism. There are many reasons cited for this. However, regardless of motivation, this often results in minimum or maximum prices being made as a means of price control. Minimum price controls. Here the price is not permitted to fall below a set level. In the case where market prices are below this level, we will have a situation of surplus and excess supply. In a simplistic example, we may cite the case of a minimum wage being made by the government, set above the market for means of equality and fairness. Perhaps more people will be stimulated still into the work market. Those who worked before will earn greater income packets than before. However, there will be excess supply of labour in the market, which in turn means lower demand. If below the equilibrium price, a labour wage increase would have no effect. The inverse of the above is also the case, assuming things remain equal. Again, the law or the assumption that economists state ceteris paribus. This, of course, is a simple understanding of the labour market, beyond the scope of this course, and one we will come to later in a more detailed course. It is possible in some circumstances that a good may never be supplied to a market, as the supply and demand conditions are incompatible and do not meet the appropriate criteria for stimulus to do so. This is illustrated in front of you now. It's possible that the good may not be produced. The highest price that the consumers are willing to pay in the top example would be P0, and that's less than the minimum price producers need to supply, which is P1. As a consequence of that, in a normal world with a normal good, assuming ceteris paribus, that good would not be produced because supply and demand would never meet. Taxes. Indirect taxes. Indirect taxes are taxes placed on the supplier that have the effect of raising costs. For this reason, they are regarded as inflationary in the macroeconomy. Again, that's beyond the scope of this module, but we will attempt to cover this in another course on macroeconomics, depending on the success of this course. There are two types of taxes. The first is ad valorem taxation, which adds a certain percentage onto the price. The second is a specific or per unit tax, which adds a fixed amount of money onto the costs. Suppliers try to pass these increased costs onto the consumer in order to maintain profits. Their ability to do this depends on the relative elasticities of demand and supply. If demand is more inelastic than supply, the consumers will pay the greater proportion of the taxation. If supply is more inelastic, the producer will pay the greater proportion of the incidence of taxation. This is represented in the following illustrations. Here, if you look at the top left-hand corner of the illustration, you see an ad valorem tax. The top right-hand corner, we'll see a specific tax. And below that, we see the incidence of producer and consumer incidence of taxation. In the bottom left illustration, we see the tax AB per unit. Consumers pay an additional P0, P1. Less is paid by the producer because demand is more inelastic than supply. In the bottom right illustration, supply is more inelastic than demand, and so producers pay the greater incidence of taxation. When calculating tax yield, things become slightly more complex. When an indirect was first introduced, the taxation yield increases as there was none to begin with. Progressive price increases may not increase tax yield, as when indirect taxation is increased, the yield will increase if demand and supply are relatively inelastic. Yields fall with increasing indirect taxation or a relatively elastic supply and demand. Whilst tax per unit is higher, numbers purchased overall reduce proportionately, therefore reducing overall revenue generated to the government. To maximise revenue, the government can widen the taxation base, tax more goods and services, therefore making it increasingly difficult to avoid goods with incidence of taxation. It becomes increasingly difficult for consumers to switch to a cheaper alternative, and so demand is inelastic. The diagram in front of you shows the incidence of taxation placed on producers. Supply shifts from S0 to S1. Tax is generated for the government at P1 BFE. Taxation increases further. S1 shifts to S2. Tax as revenue is now P2 CGH. The total revenue for the government has increased due to the demand being inelastic. A question of utility. When considering an individual satisfaction yielded, the individual consumer or producer or collective welfare to a society, from a given supply and demand, we must consider several concepts. Consumer surplus, this being the difference between a price a consumer is willing to pay and the price they actually pay. It measures the utility that the consumer receives but does not pay for. Producer surplus is the difference between willing to supply at and the price they're actually going to receive. Community surplus. This is the welfare derived to society from the supply of a good or service, and it's made up of consumer surplus plus producer surplus. As you can see in front of you, maximising community surplus. Community surplus is maximised at P0 Q0. This is the price and quantity combination which maximises the area of consumer surplus plus producer surplus. Then any other combination of price and quantity would give you less overall community surplus. Free market and community surplus. In a free market, the price mechanism will bring about equilibrium at P0 Q0 as discussed, and thus a combination of price and quantity maximises community surplus. That's why the free market is desirable and provides the optimal allocation of resources. However, so far we've only examined the efficient way in which a free market allocates economic resources. The market has a number of failures and imperfections, including aspects of the following. Free market failure includes market power, factory immobility, inequality, merit goods, externalities, instability, information problems, and public goods.